Well, it's 9:33, and so I'm going to get us started so that every precious minute is used for the work that we've convened to do this morning. I'm going to begin with a prayer. If you'll join me in prayer, let us pray. Dear God, we convene together to think about our responsibility to our children and to the future of our community and state and nation, as we focus on how best to educate them. We as Presbyterians have long been committed to education as central to the work that we do in your name. Give us strength and courage as we talk together today. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, good morning. I'm Margaret Arbuckle, and I welcome all of you to the commitment class. Some of us are regular members and some of us are from churches in Salem Presbytery. And we're so delighted that Salem Presbytery and First Presbyterian Church have convened together to do some work on what we need to do as advocates. The title of our series is Faith, Politics, and Justice. And it's hosted by Salem Presbytery and First Presbyterian Church, Greensboro. So, and this particular group that at First Presbyterian Church is our commitment class. Many of us meet together regularly every Sunday. We love it when we can be in person, but over the last couple of years, of course, we've been mainly on screens, seeing each other. And I'm using Howard's computer today, so I'm not Howard, but I'm hoping Howard will join us in a little while. Particularly, he's a fan of Ashton's, and he needs to get to know Leigh. So he'll be here. I ask that each of you, unless you're going to be speaking, that you mute yourselves. And although we love having your dogs with us, we prefer that they not talk to us while we're meeting. And we will get started. Today, as I mentioned in my prayer, today we're focusing on education, and education has been central to the Presbyterian tradition forever, I suppose. Maybe I should have looked up what the history of that is, but we certainly have made commitment to colleges. Several colleges that have been Presbyterian, started by Presbyterians here in North Carolina and across the country, and our commitment to the education of our children in our church is very central. We all know in First Presbyterian Church, Greensboro, Donna Chase leads that effort with a very strong committee of people committed to church education of our children. And then we also have, over the years, been very, very committed to the education of every child. In my knowledge, and there may be those of you who know more about the history of the world than I, but to my knowledge, the commitment that the United States has made to educate every child to read and write is unique among nations. I remind you that in the North Carolina Constitution is a commitment to the education of every child. And as a consequence, I think we look at that not only from an act of our faith, but also an act of our social commitment to the world. And so I think I'm deeply grateful for this series focusing in on the importance of public education. And we are so fortunate within our congregation to have two people who are very involved in education. My work as an advocate has been in that. I have taught little children, and I learned very quickly that I wasn't very good at what I call paper doll making. And so I'm better at the policy level and how we do it well. And then I've also taught at the university. But there amongst us, those of you who have stood in front of classrooms of children and managed that beautifully, and helping them to learn both about themselves and living in a society, and the importance of being literate and knowledgeable. And Ashton Clemmons, who is a member of First Presbyterian Church, started her career in education as a teaching fellow, which means that she, as an undergraduate at Chapel Hill, was recognized for her capacity to move into to be a leader in education. So she taught school, and then she decided that what she really would like to do is be a principal of a school, and she did that. She got the certifications and knowledge that lead her to be a principal, and she was committed to Brooks Elementary School, which is one of our schools in Greensboro that parents particularly confused to place their children. And she also was given the opportunity to
Margaret, you muted yourself somehow.
Have I not been talking? Have y'all not been hearing me talk?
We heard most of it.
Good. Well, I was introducing you, and that was what was most important.
Oh, no.
Thank you. I'll keep my hands in my lap now. Thank you. So Ashton started, I'll just repeat a minute or two. Ashton began her career as a teaching fellow, which means that she was selected in a special group of students going to the university and to colleges across our state to delve deep into education and then make a commitment to go into classrooms and teach for several years. She did that and was very successful as a teacher, very creative as a teacher, and decided that what she really would like to do would be a leader of teachers. And so she became a principal, the principal at Brooks Elementary School here in Greensboro, and then was given the challenge of taking on a school that was challenged to turn around. And that's a term that we use in education to describe what we want the results of our students' academic work to go from where it was to turn it around and make it better. And she very successfully did that. And then she decided that the way I can impact education is by becoming a public official and representing the citizens of Greensboro and Guilford County in the state legislature. So she was elected to the legislature and is, I hope, going to be running for re-election this year when we know exactly what all the districts are going to look like. And she has really moved into leadership in the General Assembly. And she is going to describe to us what's going on in the legislature in terms of education. Following Ashton will be a person whom we talked about just a second or two in our just mingling, and Leigh Curl Dove. She has beginning a new job with what's the name of the organization? In resettling of immigrants, but Church World Services. But she's also very closely affiliated with an organization called Pastors for North Carolina's Children. And our church has connected to that organization to do some of the advocacy work that they are recommending to support public education. So Ashton's going to lead off and talk to us for a few minutes. And then Leigh will talk to us, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions and comments. So Ashton, I'm gonna mute myself right now. So
okay. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. It's good to see very many familiar faces, and I actually know that the vast majority of you that I know are already actively involved in advocating with your faith, because I get emails from many of you about different issues that you're researching or things that you think we need to pay attention to, and I love that. So I also know that many people on this screen have spent more time advocating for public education, whether in the field as a school principal or a school teacher, or in other ways have spent more years doing that than I have been alive. And so I do not take lightly that I have any insight that's any different than what you all would provide from your own experiences and why you do this work and why it matters to you and your faith. So with that said, I do get to share a little bit about my own by being asked to be with the group this morning. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about how my faith has informed my beliefs about public schools, and then the current environment about our public schools, particularly within our state. And then we'll turn it over to Leigh, and I'm sure there will be great questions and conversation after that. So actually, there was a story this week that is an example of why I believe in our traditional public schools as a direct arm of who we are as Christians and who we are as Americans and North Carolinians. We are redoing, I have twin boys who are 7, and we're redoing one of their bedrooms, and a playroom we're making a hangout room because our kids are older. And I posted on my Facebook, I have this free bed, would anyone like it? And so a neighbor down the street took it, but the director of ECL for Guilford County Schools, who I'm friends with, she sent me a message privately, and she said, you know, Ashton, we have lots of kids who don't have beds that could benefit from beds. And so if you have one, please let me know. Well, it turns out that since we're redoing 2 rooms, I had 2 twin beds to give. And I said, well, Myra, I have 2 twin beds actually that I'll be able to give to you in a week. And so she said, great, just let me know when we're going to pick it up. And then this week I texted her and I said, do you also need the sheets and the blankets for the beds? Now, this is the director of ESL who works at the newcomer school. And nowhere on her job description does it say finding beds for families, right? But I said, Myra, do you need the sheets and the blankets? And she said, yes. Those beds are going to an Afghan family that we are resettling that is coming from Germany on Sunday and beginning our schools on Monday. And that is why our traditional public schools are a direct arm of who we are called to be as Christians and who we are called to be as Americans. Because that family and the most vulnerable families and children among us are always going to show up at our traditional public schools. Our children, so this is my core belief as a Christian, is that every child is innocent to where they were born. So my own children, I have 3, a 5th grader and twin 1st graders. We're very, very fortunate to be born in a family that's safe, can provide for them, has a long history of the reasons our family's predisposed to be able to do that more than another family. And my 5-year-olds, when I sent them to kindergarten, were no more deserving of that than any 5-year-old sitting in our classrooms. And God, to me, Christianity is about how we make it so that every child has an opportunity to succeed. The only place that our children are required to show up is our traditional public schools. They don't have to go to the doctor. No one is going to say, why haven't you taken your child to the doctor? We're going to force you to go to the doctor. No one is going to say, why haven't they been at the dentist? Why haven't they been to the library? But they are going to come find you and say, why are your children not in our school? Maybe something. Okay. And so what that means is that our children, no matter who they are and what their backgrounds are going, the best place that we can capture who they are and what their needs are is our public schools, because they have to go there. And that means that for the child who doesn't have a bed, who doesn't have reliable food, who doesn't have heat, who doesn't have healthcare that they need, those needs show up in our public schools. That is where they come to head, where we see them. And so sorry, Margaret, my dogs are in the background. I don't know if I can do anything about that. But that means that if we believe that those 5-year-olds, no matter who they are equally deserving, whether we believe that as Christians or as Americans or as North Carolinians, the only place we have as a system or structure in our society to make sure that that is true is our traditional public schools. So if that doesn't sell to you the importance of our system of public schools, I really don't know what else would. It is literally the only place where we make sure our children are taken care of in our society. Now, other places do a lot of good things, but they aren't required to be there. And so our most vulnerable children are going to show up in our schools and nowhere else. So that goes back to my example with the Afghan family. There are lots of our church has adopted 2 Afghan families and has been working. And I know some of you were doing that work to get them situated. I've had people from our church call me and say, I'm having trouble enrolling this child from Afghanistan. Ann Morris has been advocating, how do they get in-state tuition for higher education? So I know that a lot of us are doing that work. Those families that are getting connected through our church or other organizations are the lucky ones. And there are many families who won't get that connection. And they're just going to show up to school on Monday, like the family that we're talking about. And the teachers and the people at those schools are going to do what it takes to get them a bed and find them a place to be. And there's nothing that makes me more proud than having spent my life in schools. I have chosen to spend the majority of my career in schools where all of the kids are free and reduced lunch, because that is where we get to be who God expects us to be on a day-to-day basis. So that is, obviously on my soapbox, that is my real belief on why our public schools matter as a system and structure of who we are as a state, country, and as Christians. So then Margaret asked me to talk a little bit about where we are at the state level. And there are kind of 3 points that I want to make about current challenges if you have this belief that I've shared here. And some of you may not. And I believe you can be a Christian and not have that belief. I'm just expressing my own. One is, in our state, we have seen a deep trend in overall disinvestment in education as a state. So in the late 90s, 82% of our overall state budget went to education. That's down to 56% in the last budget that we passed. So just overall as a state, and what will be said as a response to that is, well, yes, but we're spending more dollars. That is true. And we have thousands more kids in our schools. So more dollars does not equal better, because we are also taking in billions more dollars a year than we were in that time period. So as a percentage, we've increased significantly. There's also a measure nationally of the effort that we put forth as a state to different areas. And that is the percent of your state's GDP that goes to a certain area. North Carolina is 50th out of 50 on the percent of our GDP, state GDP, that we spend on our education system. And that is K-12 and community college and university systems. So while my life has been in our K-12 system, any community college leader and public university president will tell you about the significant disinvestment in the higher education system as well. It is not limited to K-12. So as a state, we the collective we have made a decision to invest less of our resources as a proportion of the total in our education system. So that is one huge context to who we are, and a challenge if we believe in a system that works for all of our kids. The second point I want to make is there has been a movement or shift in asking about our public education system, not what is right for who we are as a state, who we are for each of our children, but instead what is right for an individual child. And we are starting to make policy decisions with the lens of what's right for an individual child instead of what is right for who we are as a country and state and community. So what that looks like is, I might say for my family, now my children are in our traditional Guilford County public schools, I will say, but I'm going to use this as an example. I might say, my child would really do well at a girls' charter school that's only for girls, 5th through 8th grade. So I'm going to make that choice. And I'm going to pay attention and do the application, and I'm going to provide transportation because that's not required to provide. And they're not going to provide lunch, but that's fine because I can send lunch for my child. And that might be right for Leigh Clemons, my 5th grader. We are making policy decisions to make it very easy for people who have access to knowledge, access to power, and access to capital to have other choices. The challenge to that is when we build our transportation system, we don't say Ashton's only going to pay for the roads that I'm going to drive on, right? We say we have to have a comprehensive transportation system because the family that lives on a rural road deserves a road the same as a family that lives in a neighborhood like mine. We are starting to undermine that we actually believe there's a system where every child should have an option. And what that means for our vulnerable children is a significant lack of investment, focus, resources, opportunity, because the choosers like me who can do all those extra things can make other choices, but our most vulnerable children will still be showing up at the public schools that are being depleted of so many resources, both financial and otherwise. So there's this movement that money followed the child. We need options. And I am here to say, I am all for options, and we have to do it in a way that keeps the system of our roads, the system of our schools strong, or else our most vulnerable children will fall through. And we know we already see that in places where we've had a significant increase. So my last point, so we got overall disinvestment in funding, this movement to be about individual children instead of our collective. And the third is, and this is the one that keeps me up at night the most, I think. I believe that we are, even in that, so this is my 4th year in the legislature. The work is more and more about power and less about problem solving for the people of our community. And as that is true, hang on, buddy. As that is true, I believe that the big powers see education as a weapon for people's frustration and are choosing to use it that way. And people are frustrated. I mean, my husband likes to say, like, the whole world's at the end of their rope right now. And I believe that is true after these years. And I believe there has been conscious choice by some in power to use education as a lane for people to use that frustration to try and gain more power. And I think ultimately that really begs the question for those of us who are involved in this on what does advocacy start to look like in a world where that is true. And I don't have an answer for that, but I think a lot of you are struggling with that. I know, because I've heard from some of you, and I just want to say that I am struggling with that too. And so the final thing I'll end with is, I spend 2 days a week in an elementary school working with at-risk boy readers. And if you get frustrated or overwhelmed, figure out a way to spend some time with elementary kids, because it will bring you back to why any of this really matters to begin with. And for me, every single one of those kids deserves it. And so that's what I come back to. And all of this crazy is that that Afghan family will have a bed because of our traditional public school system on Monday night. And the fourth graders that I read with have people who love them because of our traditional public schools. And I believe God, my relationship with God calls me to do that work, but my relationship with humanity does too. So I will end there. Is it over to Leigh now, Margaret?
Yes, Leigh, if you will give a little introduction to Pastors for North Carolina Children, and talk a little bit about what that group is and the relationship to our church, that'd be great. Thank you. Ashton, wonderful as always. Thank you. Okay, Leigh.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I have a PowerPoint, but I want to be respectful of our time. And I think if I use the PowerPoint, it'll take a while. So I'm not going to use my PowerPoint.
We could give it to Yolanda and send it to Yolanda, and she can send it out to everybody via email if you're okay with that.
Yeah, I'll email it to her after this.
Great. Thank you.
So I will talk similar to Ashton. I'm going to root this talk kind of in my why. And so for me, why advocacy? I think one of the many places we find this in scripture, which I know y'all talked a little bit about last week, is in John's gospel, when Jesus says to the disciples, "And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to be with you forever. The advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you everything and remind you of all that I have said to you." So the Holy Spirit is the great advocate. And for us as Christians to be people of the Holy Spirit, to be people led by the Holy Spirit, that calls us to advocacy. We are called to use our voices to enact change so that the hungry will be fed, the thirsty given drink, the stranger welcome, the naked clothed, the sick cared for, and the prisoner visited. And I think an important piece that Ashton touched on that involves advocacy is power, right? Like we see these people in positions of power and think, well, what can we do? But the reality is that we have power as well. We have power to bring our voices together to advocate. So I want to talk a little bit about something really important involving advocacy, and I think particularly advocacy for children in public schools, that I think Pastors for North Carolina Children does really well. And hopefully it's a term you've heard before, and that term is intersectionality. Are y'all familiar with that term? No, some yes, some no. That's great. So this term was first coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who teaches at Columbia Law School and UCLA, and she coined this term back in 1989. And so intersectionality describes how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. So I say that to say that any justice issue, any advocacy issue is intersectional. There's much more at play than what the issue presents as on the surface. And intersectionality helps us to understand the complexity and dynamics of an issue. It helps us to understand the why behind the issue. And for advocacy and justice work, to do more than just, trim the branches of a problem, it must be intersectional, because that's how we get at the root of problems. And so when our advocacy is intersectional, we can have a full view of the issue and get at the roots instead of just trimming the branches. So advocating for children in public schools is intersectional because we know that schools in lower income communities, rural communities, and communities with a higher percentage of non-white children typically have lower funding than communities that are in higher income areas, majority white areas, suburban areas, right? And kids can't help where they're born, right? That's what Ashton said that, which I thought was great. Like, kids cannot help their circumstance. And so what Pastors of North Carolina Children is doing is taking an intersectional approach to advocating for children in schools. I'm also going to make a plug for a television show that I think shows the discrepancy in public school funding while it's also very entertaining and funny. If you haven't watched Abbott Elementary on ABC, it's a great show. It's funny. It's a new sitcom, but it also shows the discrepancy in funding in schools, and shows why advocacy for children in schools matters. So Pastors for North Carolina Children, their goal, what they do is they mobilize faith communities for public education. Their mission is to serve children by advocating for North Carolina's public schools. So the need, right, which Ashton got at when she broke down the numbers and the spending and the percentages, right, is that chronic underfunding and unjust policies are preventing children from receiving the public education that's guaranteed by the state constitution. And so when schools lack basic resources, or even when kids lack basic resources at home, right? Like if they don't have a bed, children aren't going to have a chance to have an equitable education. So when schools lack basic resources, the deficiencies have an even greater impact on children with greater needs. And so Pastors for North Carolina Children is trying to answer this call, right? Because we have a moral obligation to love all of God's children and a civic responsibility to support children in our community as they learn and grow. And this public school advocacy is one of the ways. It's a compassionate way to serve children in your own congregation, in your neighborhood, in our city, in our county, and throughout the state of North Carolina. So what Pastors for North Carolina Children does is they understand this is a systemic issue, right? So traditional forms of charity or benevolence aren't necessarily going to cut it, right? Like backpack drives are great things for kids that can't get school supplies or backpacks. But what Pastors for North Carolina Children is doing is going beyond offering just charity to fill the gaps and calling on lawmakers to directly address student needs via budget and policy measures. And that goes back to the image of intersectionality, right? They're not just trying to trim the branches of the problem, but they're trying to get at the roots of the problem. And so what they're doing is they are working to grow a network of church leaders and congregations to advocate for adequate public school funding for equitable access to educational opportunities for all children. And so one of the things that they kind of have at the forefront of their mission right now, how many of you are familiar with the Leandro case, Leandro versus the state of North Carolina? Yeah, so Leandro, back in 1994, which was the year I was born, so just So that's, you know, almost 28 years ago, right? So this has been a thing for as long as I've been around. 5 school districts in low wealth counties, along with families, filed a lawsuit against the state, arguing that their school districts did not have enough money to provide equal education for their children, despite the fact that they taxed their residents higher than average. And so 25 years later, this case still remains one of the biggest policy issues in North Carolina. And those 5 counties, which are Hoke, Halifax, Robeson, Vance, and Cumberland, those 5 counties still are among the lowest funded counties in the state. And so kind of the progression of Leandro in 97, the decision was stated that children are owed a minimum standard of education and that North Carolina was failing to provide that standard. And now over 25 years later from that decision in 1997, the state still has not met its obligation. So last year in 21, the court ordered the legislature to enact the Leandro Plan as a set of policies to improve public education funding and resource distribution. So that's kind of one of the cases that's at the forefront of Pastors for North Carolina Children's work right now. And so what they've done as part of their mission to enlist and grow a network of congregations and faith leaders to help them in this work of advocacy is to start an initiative called Mission Amplify, which First Pres is part of, which is primarily letter writing. And so Mission Amplify, what it does is it combines training in public education advocacy and strategies for reaching out to elected officials. It will inform those who participate in it about the issues facing public school students. It'll build a network of groups to carry out monthly campaigns to lawmakers in support of public education. And it'll share the needs, those who participate will share the needs of students and educators with elected officials, with handwritten letters, phone calls, and or virtual or in-person meetings. And each of those monthly campaigns will focus on a single issue within public school policy that urgently needs to be addressed by the North Carolina legislature. And so their monthly issue right now is nurses in schools. So only, I think it's only 40% of North Carolina schools have the recommended ratio of nurses by the State Board of Education and the National Association of School Nurses. They recommend a nurse to student ratio of 1 to 750 students with at least 1 nurse per school. And so only 40% of public schools meet that ratio. And so again, this is when, as Ashton said, right, schools are the one place that your children are required to go to. And a lot of times that's, for some kids, that's the only place where they will have a meal for the day. That might be the only place where they get a medical professional to have a look over. If they're feeling ill, they'll go to the nurse. But it's also an issue of, kids fall on the playground, kids have allergic reactions, things happen, and they need nurses there to care for them, because otherwise you have non-medically trained people trying to administer care for something that they're not trained to do. And so a lack of nurses in schools is much more than just what it is on the surface, right? It's so much more. And so there's intersections within that issue. And so that's what Pastors for North Carolina Children is doing. They're taking an intersectional approach to their advocacy, because an issue on the surface, there's much more at play underneath. And that's where the roots of the issue are. And that's what Pastors for North Carolina Children is trying to do. And they're trying to build community partners to join that work with them. And that's all I've got. So we have some time for questions.
That's great. Thank you. Donna just texted me that Jimmy Hawkins, who is with PCUSA and is on our call. And I remind you that we have an opportunity to hear from him on Tuesday and then again next Sunday to speak on voting rights. He is really the person within our Church USA who is giving leadership on our responsibility as Christians to connect our faith, politics, and justice. So I'm going to invite him if he hears me. Jimmy, do you hear me? Oh, good. You just clicked off. There you are. Hey.
Yes.
And I know you join me in thanking Ashton and Leigh in the comments that they've made, and we invite you to give us more inspiration. So welcome. Glad to see you.
Thank you. Glad to be here today. It's just been wonderful so far. A lot of helpful information, especially since I'm out of the state now. Ashton, you really depressed me on where North Carolina's headed, because historically, we have been a leader in higher education, especially in funding of public schools, and to see that we're 50 out of 50 is just very distressing, but we're doing everything we can on the national level. And I don't want to take away from where you are, but I will be, in the next 4 sessions, I think, myself and my staff will be with you. And so I'm excited about the series.
And I think everybody on this screen understands that I am a Christian, but I'm also an active in politics, and the connection of those two things in my life, and I hope in the life of many of us, are important. So I appreciate very much you're going to help us focus on voting rights this week at the Presbytery meeting and then next Sunday. So thank you so much for being here. Now let's open up the screen for a conversation. And if you'll raise your hand, I'll try to recognize you. Betsy and Jack.
Well, and my Jack is at with the second graders at church this morning. There's the ones who are getting ready for their communion. I am interested in, the funding disparities are often because of who is in the wealth level of the parents in the school, not necessarily what the taxpayer input is. I would be interested, Ashton, as you or Leigh too. It seems to me that there are disparities. I will say I was in one school where when my children were young, where there lots of very wealthy neighborhoods feeding the school, and we could raise a ton of money as a PTA and build playground equipment. I mean, it could just be done. We moved, and then our kids were in a school where it was, there was a fund drive for like $150 that we were trying to raise. It was really an eye opener to me, the difference based on that, rather than just what taxpayer money brings in. I mean, I'm interested in your just making some comments or some insight in that, as opposed to just what the state budget puts out for everybody.
I think that's an insightful question that really is getting at my point that the shift to choosers being able to be out of our traditional public schools is more than just about the funding going to the traditional public schools. And over history, like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who writes so much about what happens, is that the fight for public schools is a fight for integrated schools, period, end of story. Because when schools are integrated, the families that have the resources benefit all the kids in that school, just as you're saying happened in some of your kids' school. And our schools are more segregated now than in 1960. And so like that what is happening is we have our schools are becoming more and more segregated, which means more and more variation of resources beyond what the state is funding. So that I think is very true. The other thing I'll say is, as we've had a significant decrease in state funding, localities have been asked to pick up things that were traditionally funded at the state level. And so what that means is communities like ours, Mecklenburg, Wake County, where we have taxable property tax bases to have more resources at a county, we're able to give more to our teachers, more supplements, more funding for different things at the county level. And so we are not, there is as state investment has decreased, it has increased disparities by both local families and communities who can give more do, and county commissions who can and decide to do more do. But what does that mean for the kids who are not benefiting from either of those situations? And I'll go back to my point, is the 5-year-old in that school system any less deserving than the 5-year-old in any other school system, right? So I think that the disinvestment is really exacerbating other inadequacies, even no one is getting adequate, and it's making the disparities greater. And that's well documented by research and data. I think Margaret Knox has a question.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm actually Peggy, but I wanted to comment on the ratio of nurses to students. It's really a terrible ratio, and that's the ideal. I mean, that's the 1 to 750 is just kind of incredible, because one thing that strikes me is that it's also nurses who will pick up things like malnourishment and bruises on a body. It's the nurse that the child might confide in, that someone visits them in the middle of the night and is sexually abusive. You know, I mean, it's the nurse who is the conduit for taking care of so many things. And with 1 to 750 being the ideal, we're not even at that. That's really appalling and really scary.
Peggy, I have advocated for this for a number of years, and the thing that keeps haunting me is we haven't had children die in the classroom, and because we didn't have access to medical care. It's very dire. Yes.
Numbers to 2,400.
Jack Glenn, did you?
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
I'm on a strange computer. Maybe I should use this every week. Question for the long term, is it something we should consider to have the church sponsor scholarships for nurses who agree to do some kind of service after graduation? I realize that's a long-term, not an immediate response, but it's something to think about, and it might make being a member of the church a little more appealing than it was the day before yesterday. So that's one thought. And secondly, question, do the number of minority teachers in the Guilford County public school system kind of match the numbers of supposed minorities, majorities maybe, in the system among the students? I'm not in favor of ratios, but just acknowledging what they might be useful.
Do you know those numbers, Ashton? It is a continuing issue, and certainly one that I'm aware of through the School of Education at UNCG. The efforts to recruit students of color to become teachers, and they're doing that at UNCG and at A&T. But I don't know what that actual ratio is. I
think in Guilford County, I think it's a good question. In Guilford County, we are actually much better than the state average, and still not anywhere close to where we should be. So I think in Guilford County, our student population is about 68%, 69% students of color. This is pre-COVID data. I will tell you that many of the white families I think statistically have left in the past couple of years. So I'm not sure what that number is now. And I think the teaching population is about 35% teachers of color in Guilford County. Across the state, the population is only 12% teachers of color. So
I just
yeah,
recall.
so
Go ahead. Oh, I can't hear you anymore. Okay. I just recall reading a book on education a few years ago, several years ago now, and it was noting that in the great move towards integration of the public schools, that the people who got fired were the Black teachers, and the white teachers kept their power. And it's something regrettable in the sense that apparently Black students may well look up to their Black teachers, and did prior to the full integration efforts. And I just point that out. And as to the scholarship thing, it's just meant to be positive.
So I think the the scholarship thing, that's a really positive and good idea. But again, that's one of the things that you still need to advocate to increase funding for nurses, because you can pay for a handful of nursing students to go to nursing school with the agreement that they'll go into a school, but that's while that will provide maybe more nurses to go into schools, it's not necessarily a solution to such a big problem. So that's why it still matters to advocate, in addition to doing other things, right? This isn't a just do one thing, fix all. But that's why the advocacy of it still matters. You have Ashton, yes, it's a both and. Because if you pay scholarships for nurses to go to nursing school and then to be school nurses, if there's not funding for them to go into that, or if there's not more nurses for 2,400 students than just one, right? There's going to be burnout. And it's, so that's why the advocating for that matters, in addition to finding other creative ways to help the problem.
Nancy Courts, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you are the nurse professional amongst us whom I know. And Nancy was on the faculty of School of Nursing at UNCG for years. And if you would like to unmute yourself and give us a word of inspiration, I would appreciate it.
Yes, I would like to speak to this because nurses most definitely make a difference in schools. I have a former student who's a member of our church who's a school nurse, and the stories she tells me and the challenges she has just to maintain a very low level of meeting the legal requirements. We definitely do. There are all kinds of issues. You can't imagine the kinds of problems that students come to school with. Some of them have seizure issues. Some of them have feeding tubes where they have to be fed through a tube at school. Would you like me to go on, Margaret? The bottom line is, yes, we do need more nurses. And I think funding in some way would be wonderful. And I suggest that anybody who's interested, call up the university and do an endowed scholarship, and you can see that it's made just for a student who is willing to be a school nurse. So I applaud this. I recommend it. I tell you, the issues are real. Do you have any specific questions? Anybody?
Nancy, our time is about to run out, and I just kind of put you on the spot, but I appreciate very much your comments. Thank you so much. Yeah. And I want to ask Ashton if she has any closing comment to send us on to church with. Thank you.
I just want to make one response to Reverend Hawkins said it's depressing where North Carolina is going. And I'll just say, like, where North Carolina is going is on all of us.
Mhm.
People ask me all the time, like, what's the accountability for X or Y? And I'm like, it's democracy. Like, it is painful, it is slow, it's exhausting, and it's all we have. And so, like, where we go as a community and as a state is on all of us. And you know that's why you're spending a Sunday doing this. But I'm just grateful to all of you because we need creative ideas like Jack's of like give the bed to the family right now while advocating, right? Like we need creative ideas for the immediate and sustained commitment to the future that we will be hoping to live into. And that really is on all of us. And I'm just grateful to all of you for being part of it. Thank you for having me, Margaret, and everyone.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Leigh. And thank you for the leadership that Pastors for North Carolina Children is giving us in our church and in our denomination. Thank you, each one of you. Go and pray about this issue and think about what we each one can do and what we collectively can do to support our schools and our children and our future. God bless you. See you at church.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks to our speakers.